Music, acting as a form of expression and non-aggressive protest against the U.S. government, played a crucial role in the 1960s and 70s, the time period of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam anti-war movement arose from public disapproval of the Vietnam War. The war, beginning in 1964, was the result of the United States' desire to halt the spread of communism. This war was a manifestation of the hostilities between the United States and the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War, which began directly after the end of World War II. The Soviet Union's communist government and ideologies spread to China. Following the communist takeover of China, the red tide began to flow into Indochina. The war between North and South Vietnam got worse due to the presence of the Viet Cong, a militant communist group gaining power in South Vietnam. Anti-war tendencies among American citizens began to appear as the United States became more and more involved in the Vietnam conflict. Protests began to spring up around the nation to show a peaceful discontent of American influence in regional Asian conflicts. While the majority of the peaceful dissidents protested the war through picketing and lobbying in mass groups, a select few took a different path. These few fought the war through music. Their music brought to light that the American people longed for peace and neutrality, and some songs, such as War Pigs, expressed some feeling of dissatisfaction in those who dragged the United States into a seemingly pointless war.
War Pigs is a song by English heavy metal band Black Sabbath. Geezer Butler, bassist and lyricist for the band, said, "War Pigs is, quote, totally against the Vietnam War, and how these rich politicians and rich people start all the wars for their benefit, and to get all the poor people to die for them," end quote. The song was released in 1970 in Black Sabbath's Paranoid album, while the Vietnam War was in full effect. This phrase points at people who authorize wars but generally stay away from fighting. Soldiers in Vietnam were easily disposed of in war, just like pawns are in the game of chess. This line reminds us that there is a higher power controlling the pawns, this being the United States government in their response to the threat of communism.
Fortunate Son is centered on the inequalities of the lower and middle classes going to fight in Vietnam, as opposed to the privileged classes who did not have to. It is written from the perspective of the poor average Joe who was drafted and exposes those who had strings pulled, so they only had to be part of the reserves.
I'm no senator's son. I'm no fortunate one.
The speaker says that he is not a fortunate senator's son, so he must fight the war for those privileged enough to be excused from fighting. While the rich help themselves and fuel the war effort by offering their money instead of themselves or their sons, the unfortunate ones are thoroughly exploited and sent off to war, many of them to never return to the U.S.
I hope they get what we came for, that's the money. I think they will this time. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy to
Imagine, arguably the official anthem of the anti-war movement, was released by John Lennon in 1971, in the midst of the Vietnam War. Since Lennon was from the band of the 60s, the Beatles, and was still a prominent figure throughout much of the world, in the lines,
Imagine there's no country. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. No religion too.
Lennon encourages the listener to imagine a world at peace without the barriers of borders or the divisions of religion and nationality, and to consider the possibility that the focus of humanity should be living a life unattached to material possessions. He even goes on to sing,
You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one.
In this message to the world, Lennon acknowledges the rest of the anti-war movement and states that peace begins within the hearts of the people.
Each of these artists took a stand in history against the United States government and their authority to go to war without the consent of the American people, and then after, conscripting young men, forcing them to go fight the aimless cause which was the Vietnam War. Through their music, these artists were able to express themselves and their views as well as the views of the American people through a universal concept, music.